So I thought I saw it on the stream before. Hi everybody, sorry. We thought that we were streaming. My apologies. Let me see if this is coming through. Let's give it another second here.
Yep, there we go.
Now it's coming through.
Yep.
Is the old data there? Can you go back? Can you scrub back? Nope. Crap. Okay, so let's talk about timers then. It's okay, we can start from here. We're just on slide 5. So let's talk again about timers and callbacks in the context of timers. And the callback that we're going to be talking about is one that we pass to the setTimeout function. So callbacks, they're just a function that you pass to another function. They're different than others because you're passing them as an argument. And the code that calls that function that you pass as an argument is usually not code that you write yourself. Now, it could be. I want to stress that you can, in fact, write functions that take functions as arguments and then call them at some later point in time. That's perfectly fine. That's called like callback-based programming. We are slowly moving away from that. It used to be much more common in JavaScript. But in this case, the setTimeout function is written in the browser. So it's probably not written in JavaScript. It's probably written in C++ or C or Rust, another programming language that is designed for building like really big systems like operating systems and things like that. In this case, the function that you passed in the first place, it probably is going to get sort of stored somewhere until later. Like in the case of an event handler, when we do add event listener on an element, it gets called as a callback when that event listener gets triggered. In the case of our setTimeout, what's going to happen is that your callback function is going to get called after a certain amount of time has elapsed as the browser knows time, right? So the browser is going to say, okay, this much time has gone by. It's now time to call the function that was passed in as a parameter. So let's see what this looks like in a second. This could be like seconds or minutes or hours later after you have the function get passed as an argument. So let's take a look at setTimeout. All right. So there's this built-in function setTimeout. It's global in JavaScript, and you use it with 2 parameters. So it gets called, and 2 parameters get passed to it. The first thing that gets passed is a callback function. We're going to abbreviate that with we're just call it F for now. And then it also takes a number of milliseconds to wait, and we can call that N for now, okay? And the function setTimeout doesn't wait and block the browser and doesn't allow you to do anything until that amount of time has gone by. It actually returns right away. So after you call setTimeout, the program continues to run. It just registers an event to occur in the future. So setTimeout doesn't actually trigger the time immediately. It triggers it later on. And so after approximately however many n milliseconds was passed into setTimeout, that function f gets called. So this is an example, right? Actually, open up like a browser window right now, like a tab, and then go to the JavaScript console in that browser tab and try this now. Type in this code, and I'll zoom in so it's a little bit bigger. See if I can zoom in here a little bit. Yeah, there we go. So type in this code, create a function called later, and that function later is going to console.log see you later, ... in a string. And then it's going to call setTimeout with this variable alligator, and then a comma and the number 1000. And that's the whole definition of the function later. That's the whole definition of the function later. But then right after the function later, you have to write a second function called alligator, which is the one that we passed as this argument. Now you could have defined it ahead of time too. Before or after, it actually doesn't matter. Create that function alligator. It doesn't need to take any arguments. Console.log alligator, and then call later. Then call it with the open close parentheses. And when you call later, what will happen is nothing. Well, I'm sorry. It'll console.log see you later, and then nothing will happen for a second. And then after that, alligator should get logged to the console. Does everybody see that? Sure. Yeah, you could say that. It's like turning a timer, like on an egg timer or something, and it's going to go off at some point in the future. It'll be about the time that you spun it to. It might not be exactly the same time. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So you could now, you could have also, here's another way to do this. You could have had there been a number come into this later function. If a number comes into this later function, like 5,000 or 10,000, 3,000 or whatever, you could have written later to accept an argument and then pass that argument to the set timeout. So that if you called later with 10,000 or 5,000 or 3,000, it would wait different times. It would wait different times. That's possible. Which is always fun. Okay. If you want to read more about the set timeout, there's some good documentation here from the MDN on it. It's kind of like, this is kind of a weird name, right? It's like window or worker global scope dot set timeout. It's very verbose. Yeah, there we go. Which is, kind of makes it hard to know what it's talking about. But all this is a documentation for the set timeout function. That's all this is. It's just that this function lives on either the window or this special thing called a worker, which we haven't talked about yet. So it's global. That's what it is. It's global. Okay? And it takes a number of things. It takes the function and then a delay and then, optionally a delay. And then optionally some parameters, which you don't have to use. And it does just what we showed it does. And if you want to see an example, here's an example. So we click on this, show an alert box after 2 seconds. Oh, there it is. And it just keeps going. Must click it twice. So that's the documentation for set timeout, which I would recommend give it a look, because there's a few little tricks about set timeout that are kind of interesting that you could learn in there. But there's another way to write your callback function as well, and that's that you could use an inline callback. So remember that callback functions are just functions. You can define them in the place where you pass them. So that's called an inline function. If you define it where you pass the function as a parameter, then it's an inline function. And another name for those are called anonymous functions. Because it's a function, it does all the things a function does. It's just that you haven't given it a name. You don't need to give it a name in this case, because you're defining it and using it in the same place, which means that you can't really use it somewhere else. You're defining it and using it right there. I mean, I guess you could give it a name and use it somewhere else, but that would be a really weird way to do it. So most of the time when you define and use a function right in the same place, you don't use it again. And so it's a one-time thing, so having a name for it is sort of extra. It's not needed. That's why they're anonymous. Okay.
Could I, before you go to the next slide?
Oh, I was just going to scroll down.
Yeah, oh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that this this is like JavaScript at its worst because of all the curly braces and parentheses and commas where you don't expect a comma, right? Could I have the pointer? So see that comma? It's right after a curly brace. That's actually this whole thing. Like I wish we had a whiteboard on the wall so I could draw it. This entire code, line of code, not line, several lines of code, starting here and ending here is the function, which means that its entire code from here to here is one parameter. It's like you started a string on one line and then ended the string 3 lines later. And then comma, because there's a second parameter, which is the number of milliseconds. This is really hard to understand until you've done it like 1,000 times. But once you've done it 1,000 times, then your eyes will click and be like, oh, I see that as like a function call with 2 parameters, and the first one's an inline function. But you need to like go through the motions and actually like maybe like print it out or like select it. You know, select it in your text editor to make sure that your eyes are learning the lessons that are up there. Otherwise, it's just going to be like gibberish. But does that make sense? That like this is one of the reasons why people think of JavaScript as like a difficult language. It's like JavaScript is made of knives, right? This is one of the reasons why, because the syntax just can get really inscrutable until you've done it many times. Any questions? Do you all see that this is really just calling setTimeout alligator comma 1000, just like the previous slide? Any questions about that? All right, thank you.
Is there any reason that you would use an anonymous function there versus just defining?
Yeah, because if you're not going to use it again, then it could feel like you're creating all these extra functions just to use them in one place. Okay, and the other is that you could have a function. We're going to start getting kind of weird if I mention this, but you could have a function that also accepts a callback function. And so you define that second callback function passed to the first one as an argument to the first argument of the setTimeout function. So sometimes it's sort of like a code organization strategy, all right? To keep your definitions where they're used, so that you don't have to go around looking for them. That's the most common reason to define them once and only once, so that everything's in the same place. It does, however, make the code harder to read, as Alex mentioned, until you've seen this style a number of times. And the first time I saw this, I was like, you know, kind of felt astray, as many other people do the first time they see this kind of thing. But it's valid JavaScript syntax. If you look at it, we're just creating a function right in line where we're passing it as an argument. And we have to remember that functions in JavaScript are first class, which means that you can pass them around as values themselves. The function itself is a value that can get passed around and altered. And it isn't just some procedure that gets looked up. Like, it can get changed as the program runs. So that's one of the advantages of JavaScript as a language, even though it does lead to some syntax which looks a little wonky the first time you see it.
When I see anonymous functions inside of other functions like this, I often think that like the arrow function might be a better syntax.
You could.
Is that true? Yeah. Okay.
It's a shorter syntax.
Okay.
And because it's shorter, some people like it for that reason. Because it's less syntax, it's sometimes easier to read. Other times people don't like it because they see it and it feels really dense. And so they're looking at this code and it seems like it's doing a lot of things even though there's not a lot of characters on the screen. So I agree that arrow functions tend to make more sense to me when I see them there. But some people look at an arrow function, particularly if they're just learning the language, and they think, this is doing a lot, I'm kind of confused, I don't know what's going on here. So it's a little bit of a trade-off.
Is it fair to say that arrow functions are only appropriate when the alternative is an anonymous function?
No. Arrow functions have a particular set of good use cases. And they are becoming more and more prevalent as well. Because their syntax is just less, there's less syntax there, and you don't have the same difficulties around the this pointer that we talked about on Tuesday, where particularly if you have a function that has a this bound outside of its callback, when it gets used in a callback and you depend on the this pointer, the problem with a typical function is that the this pointer is not what you believe it is, because the this pointer gets detached when you pass that function in as a callback to a timer function like this. So the problem with that is that oftentimes you'll think that you can access some property, but you cannot. A callback using an arrow function gains its this pointer based on the place in which it is called. So the context in which it is called. It inherits its this pointer from its outer scope. Okay. So if you find yourself in that situation, sometimes using an arrow function will be the right thing to use. Okay. Cool. All right. So we've seen what this does, right? We've seen what this does. It does the same thing as the prior slides. It just does it in line. So no difference except for the syntax. And this is definitely a little denser code because it's all in one place. So if it looks a little uncomfortable to you, that's okay. You can break it out into a separate function. All right. So let's do a little lab now. Let's measure how accurate timeout is. All right. So this is what I want you all to do. I want you to open up a browser tab and open up the JavaScript console in that browser tab. And let's figure out how accurate our setTimeout actually is. How accurately it fires and triggers that callback. So here's what we're going to do. Write a function called wait a second. And we want wait a second to do a few things. We want it to get the current time in milliseconds and save that time as a variable. So you could call that time start or begin or whatever. And then use setTimeout to set up a 1 second timer. So 1,000 milliseconds, you want to set a timer for that. Then when the callback executes, get the current time at that moment. So again, you're going to use the date.now. You're going to set that into a different variable than the first one you started with. And then subtract the start time from the new current time and print whatever that value is. So in a perfect world, this is going to be what? What would this be in a perfect world? 1,000. However many milliseconds we expect. Yeah. So let's see if it's 1,000. So run that function a bunch of times and tell us what you see when you do that. Tell us what you see. So everybody try that right now. Type it into your console and try it out. I'm going to do it as well, so you'll be able to see it, but I'm not going to run it until you all are doing it. I'm not going to give you the answer right away. You good? Yeah, we're going to do 1 more minute and then show a solution here.
Screw you, man.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Press the arrow key and everything went away.
Yeah, you can, all this stuff works in Node.js as well. So if you want to use a text editor and run it from the command line, that'll be fine too. You don't need to use that, yeah. Yeah, sometimes when you're like writing code in the console, it does disappear. So.
I think you meant on the slides. Was it on slides that things went away?
No, if you hit the up arrow.
I started to write a function.
Oh no!
Right, like it's just the console is not a text editor as much as it wants to be.
Yeah.
How far off am I, Alex?
All right, so I'm going to show one solution to this. Who's able to get it to work? Who got it to work?
I'm almost there.
Okay, we're almost there. I'm going to give you another minute then. Got not a number, that's cool. Sounds like you're doing some addition on something that's undefined, maybe. Or subtraction.
You want to pass in a function that when it gets called will be console.log. And we'll call it console.log. Do you follow? It's really, this is really like tricky.
Okay.
So remember when you were talking about like let's use an anonymous inner function, do that. Yeah, or that.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, that's very close. Yep. That's it. That's all you need to do, and then close the brace later. Like not there. That was not. No, you were almost correct. Okay, so I'll show you.
Okay.
Stop. When it settles down, I'll show you what I mean. Okay. Undo. Just undo because that was just not right. Okay. So that is an open brace.
Yep.
You need to close it there before the comma, right? Because you're defining a function and then immediately passing that function in as the first parameter.
I did it.
Do you see
You
that?
did it.
So you're
You have
defining
one.
it. You're not calling it yet. In fact, you'll never call it.
It's not that.
Set timeout calls it in a second.
This is hard to get.
It's really this is
Well,
this
it's
is
hard to get it doing it in the console because you need to go up on it.
Why do you need a function?
because a function is code you can call later, whereas a function call is happening right now. It's just happening. You can't make it happen later because it just happened. But calling it a function means I want to call this later. It's putting it in a little box with a do not open until March 31st or whatever, right? A little sticker on it. It's putting it in a box. And then you're passing that box around.
So you think this would work?
Yeah, except that I think there's another syntax error, but no, that looks right. Yeah.
Why did I do it?
So now you need, what are you looking for?
How do I run this?
So if you saved it, yeah, there you go. Yeah. So, yeah. So that's close.
Should it be different every time?
Oh, D.
It could be.
It's
Date
not
done
new.
now.
No,
It's different
date
when I
done
run
now.
it in VS Code
Yeah.
and when I run it in the console. If I run it multiple times in the console, it's different.
Close. Almost at it. A for effort.
It's different than when you run it in the Node console versus the browser. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and the browser.
So this one, I think I know what's going on here.
Okay.
The browser is correct every time?
This is a node
Yeah.
feature, which is
Yeah.
It's different than that.
Yeah.
programs exiting.
But
So
doing that with the-
think about that for a second. Why would Node be different than the browser?
I was wrong. Yep. You actually have to validate.
They're different environments. Yeah. They're different environments.
Well, I'm getting different results in the node for code.
And in the console,
So now run it
probably
again.
like a few milliseconds every time you hit it.
Up arrow enter is easier to type.
Yeah,
There you go. Oh, it's a
that's-
little different.
You know this is all moot, right? Scientists got the
Is it?
theory to go backwards.
Yeah, I saw something quickly in
Gotcha.
I don't know what you just
the
said.
news yesterday.
But somebody
I
invented
just
time
saw
travel
it.
this
I
week?
saw a headline that somebody supposedly got something to go back in time. About like a
Quantum.
Oh, it's a little different than that. What happened is that it reversed entropy for a very short amount of
Oh, it
moment.
just reversed entropy. That's all.
So it's a quantum state progressed forward, and then they were able to induce it to progress backwards.
That actually is subtly different.
It is subtly different.
Entropy is a widely misunderstood concept.
Yeah,
It is. There's a very well-known way to reduce entropy known as Maxwell's demon. If you want to look that up, it's really interesting.
Like candles and blood.
No, it has to do with creating.
Yes.
It's a little different than that.
Yes.
It's creating like imagine creating a mirrored cube with a very small slit that can only allow one photon in or out. Normally, you would in a large space you would have those photons spread out and disperse, right? Like they teach you in science. But what happens with a small like mirrored box is that the photons actually congregate into one smaller space. So that's a reversal of entropy, like in the grander scheme of things, but it's not reversing time.
Yeah, it is not the same. All right, JavaScript can stay the way it is.
Yay! Okay, so let's see here. I think let's reveal what we have here. So let's click this solution here. Oh, I need to come out. That's interesting. I need to come
If
out.
you hit Command 0, it should do it, but whatever. That's Command 0 to resize to 100%, but whatever.
I thought I was already at 100%. Let me
No,
see.
You changed the layout.
Nope, not on this slide. I didn't.
Click the solution. Oh, and then Command 0.
So I wasn't wrong.
And then Command 0.
Yeah, I just did that.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay.
Learn something new
Yeah.
every day.
So let's expand it here. So here's a solution to this. I'll go back to the slides in a second. Did anybody have something like this where we say date equals date.now, start equals date.now rather, and then we say set timeout and we pass a function. We say let end equals date.now and we console.log end minus start, and then we have 1000. Anybody try something like that?
Similar.
Lance did. Did it work?
Same thing pretty much. Well, it was off by 1 or 2.
It was off by 1 or 2, yeah. So if I pop this
I put mine in this.
into a REPL really quick, or console, sorry, I use those two terms interchangeably, although they're not. So if I call wait a second a bunch of times,
No, you still need the parentheses.
so note that
No.
1001, 1004, 1005, 1001. What's happening here? Why aren't they right? Why aren't they right? Does anybody know? If anybody knew the answer to this, I'd be super impressed.
Before we try to speculate why, what other thing are we noticing about those numbers? Yes, they're not equal to 1,000 all the time.
Yeah, they're not equal to 1,000.
What else is true about that set of numbers?
More than 1,000.
They're always more than 1,000. Or maybe sometimes exactly, but they're never less than 1,000. That is the promise that setTimeout makes, is that I'm going to call you a little bit after the time has elapsed. Not exactly, because that would be millisecond timing, and that's for like animation engines and stuff. And JavaScript does not want to be that precise. It doesn't want to have to make that kind of promise.
Is it because it depends on how fast the browser is actually doing it?
Kind of. It depends on a bunch of things. It's an wait at least 1,000 milliseconds. And what happens is after 1,000 milliseconds elapses, what happens then is that this function gets stuck onto what's called a queue. Now we've talked about stacks, where you put cards down on a table, and then you pop the first one off the top, and so on and so on. A queue works the opposite way. Instead of taking from the top, you take from the bottom. You deal from the bottom. And if there's other things in that queue, just like if you're waiting in line at the butcher, or if you're waiting in line at the deli, they have to get taken care of first. And so if your browser is busy doing something else before it gets to calling your function, then it might take a few milliseconds before it gets there. But it is guaranteed to take at least 1,000 milliseconds and then be somewhere in the ballpark of being on time. But what this means is that if you call setTimeout a bunch of times, and they're all at least 1,000 milliseconds and then a few extra milliseconds, and you're doing that for lots of seconds. Like let's say you're calling this every second, you're calling a timeout function. How many seconds is it going to take before you're off by more than a non-noticeable amount?
Off by a second.
Right? Off by a second at least.
It'll take less than 1,000 times.
Right. So
Before you're
there's
off by an entire
3,600 seconds in an hour, right? So it should take about 20 minutes or less, somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes of calling timeout over and over again before you're starting to be off by seconds. This is called clock drift. It's a really well-known problem in a lot of different types of systems. But JavaScript has this problem. If you were to call a timer over and over again, it'll start drifting, meaning that if you expect it to call it 1,000 times in 1,000 seconds, well, it might not call it 1,000 times. It might call it like 998 times or 997 times in 1,000 seconds. So you just got to keep that in mind when you're dealing with timers in JavaScript, that they're not accurate. Alex.
However, there is something that is accurate down to the millisecond that we do know already. What is that? Date.now. So date.now is synchronized with the CPU clock. There's an actual timing crystal that's vibrating at a certain number of million times a second, and the CPU is using that to measure what the actual number of milliseconds elapsed is. And so date.now is always really accurate. So if you want to find out, if you wanted to rely on this, like God said, to do a clock, you're doing it wrong. But if you wanted to have this be called, like call something several times a second, and then each one of those times it gets called, you then say, oh, has another second elapsed, right? It's a two-step process, right? This just lets your events get called, right? Lets your timers get called, but it's not doing the actual measurement of whether a real second has elapsed on wall clock time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you have down to millisecond accuracy in date.now. You just don't have, you can get a drift if you're calling setTimeout over and over again. So you have to be a little clever when you're dealing with that. So let's look at a nice way to be able to call a timer many times, all right? So setTimeout has a sibling called setInterval, okay? And it works a lot like setTimeout, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? So after calling our setInterval, JavaScript is going to call your callback over and over and over again. However many, the gap will be whatever the interval time that we pass in. So if we say count down from some number and our interval is 1,000, then every second we're going to call this function called tick. Now, what do we assign this to? What's the variable we're assigning this function call to? What is this variable's name? Right here?
Interval ID.
Interval ID. Why would we name that variable interval ID? Why do we think we might call it that?
Because we're initializing what the interval is going to be.
Okay, that's a good guess. But what is this equal to? This is equal to the return value of setInterval. It's equal to the return value of setInterval. So setInterval gives us something back, and we're calling it our interval ID. So what is this most likely giving us back? It's giving us back, we think, a string, an object, probably, maybe, yeah, a number. And our interval ID is, to JavaScript, a way to look up this particular timer that is firing once every second. All right, so internally, inside the JavaScript engine, it keeps track of this timer using that ID. We might need that in the future if we wanted to stop the timer, okay? That's why we're assigning it over to a variable so that we can hold on to that number and maybe use it again in the future. Our tick function, it just logs out whatever the number is, and then it says number equals number minus 1, so we subtract 1 from whatever the number, we assign that to the new number, and we say if the number is less than or equal to 0, we say console log blast off, and we clear interval with the interval ID. Does everybody see that? This is another global timer function that's built into the browser. It's on the window, it's called clearInterval, and it accepts a number, and that number corresponds to the timer that is running away inside the browser for us. And if we don't have that number, if we didn't put this into a variable, then we wouldn't be able to reference this exact timer inside of JavaScript, and we wouldn't be able to clear it. It would just continually tick away over and over again. And if we call a countdown from a second or a third or a fourth time, we would have 4 of these timers that are just ticking away inside of the browser. And this is actually a large source of bugs, is people forget to log their interval IDs on these timers, and then they forget to clear them when they're done with their timer. So this works for setInterval. Okay? It also works for setTimeout. What do we think it does with setTimeout, though? What do we think it does with setTimeout? Instead of clearing an ongoing interval, if we had our interval cleared with setTimeout, what do we think it's going to do with setTimeout?
Stop it from going off in the first place.
Yeah, it's going to stop it from going off in the first place. Exactly right. If you saw, I tried to not linger on it for too long, but if you saw in the documentation in the MDN, that button that I clicked that created an alert in 2 seconds, right below that was another button that said, clear the alert. So if I clicked the first button and then right away clicked the lower button, it wouldn't fire the alert because it would have cleared that timer before it actually fired. Okay? So if we say countdown from 10 here, it's going to go through, 10's going to come in, it's going to set up our interval, it's going to call tick, it's going to set up 10 as our number, and then it'll actually start to subtract 1 from it, and then after 10 seconds, it'll call blast off, and then it'll clear the interval. So this gets called once every second for 10 seconds. Gets called once every 10 seconds. So it's sort of like looping in a way. It's just going to not loop in an explicit loop or a while or something like that. It's going to loop by actually calling and passing state back and forth. Okay. Any other questions about that right now? Is there a hand up? Did I miss it? Okay, sorry. Sometimes I scan the room. I don't have really great eyesight, so if I missed your hand, I apologize. So that's our setInterval function. And so when do we use one of these things versus the other? They both seem to behave in similar ways, but they are really very different because although that they both call a callback function after a certain amount of time, our setInterval continues to call over and over again until we tell it to stop, where our setTimeout doesn't call over and over again. We would have to create a new timeout call at the end of each prior setTimeout. Okay, you can achieve sort of similar results. This is an example if we were to be using countdown from with number, but instead of calling setInterval, if we call setTimeout with tick in 1000, in our tick function, we do the same decrementing of the number and calling blast off when it reaches 0, but when it's not 0, we call setTimeout again with tick in another 1000 milliseconds. So this isn't relying on setInterval to do it every second. It's instead calling setTimeout at the end of each of these function calls. And then that starts the whole process over again. Connor?
Can you put it in a while loop?
Could you put it in a while loop? No, and I'll tell you why. What happens with a while loop is that, does setTimeout stop execution of your code?
No.
It doesn't, right? So what would happen in a while loop, if you had a while loop that counted down from 10, what would happen is that it would decrement the number from 10 to 0. And then it would do that very, very quickly. And instead of enqueuing 10 countdowns 1 second apart, it would enqueue 10 countdowns like 1 millisecond apart or less. Because it would just run through creating all of those countdowns very quickly. And then they would all get called at about the same time because they're not enqueued 1,000 milliseconds from one another's calls in the use of a while. They're enqueued 1,000 milliseconds after they're first called. And because the while can run really quickly, like it could easily run tens of thousands of times per second, you'd end up with that many ticks, however many you're using to decrement from some number down to 0. Make more sense? Yeah. Any other questions about that? That's a great question, though. A lot of people make the error of trying to use while with this, and they end up with all of their timeouts firing at the same time, and they're like, what is going on? I don't understand. And it's the difference between something getting called in the future and something running right now. And it's hard to see that because we don't get to see the machine run in programming. That's one of the harder skills to acquire as a programmer, is being able to imagine how the machine's going to run. And it takes a long time to get to that point. So sometimes you just have to experiment with it until you get a more intuitive sense of what's happening. And sometimes you need to check the documentation and remember that setTimeout returns immediately. There's no delay. When you call setTimeout, it happens right away. But then the callback doesn't occur until at that timeout period has elapsed. All right? Other questions about that? Bob?
So what would be more performant in this case? Doing the setInterval and then clearing it afterwards, or doing the setTimeout?
It depends on what you mean by performant, but so what's going to happen is if you call setTimeout over and over and over again, you are actually creating multiple enqueuings of a function to happen in the future. The way that setInterval works, so you're creating 10 timers in the JavaScript engine that have to be managed by the JavaScript engine over time. Now, only one of them exists at a time, but 10 actually get created. With a setInterval, you only create one timer, and the JavaScript engine manages that one timer. You get one timer ID. So you can clear that one timer ID, rather than creating 10 timer IDs. So what I'll have to say is that in terms of behavior, they're about equivalent. If I had to wager a guess, it would be that setInterval is more performant because it doesn't use as much memory as something like enqueuing 10 timers over 10 seconds would. Make more sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it doesn't matter.
But it doesn't really matter.
They're essentially the same
Yeah.
speed. This would be like, probably nanoseconds.
Yeah. If you had like a 16K computer and you were worried about memory, then it would be a big deal. Like people used to think really hard about this kind of stuff back in the 1980s. But now we have computers with gigabytes of memory, and that's for like everybody has one of those in their pocket. So we don't have to worry about it as much. Yeah. Cool. So with that, what I'd like to do is 8 o'clock, I'd like to take a break. So we're going to take a 15-minute break. We're going to come back. And then we're going to walk through 2 examples, one with doing selection and one where we're going to talk about the introduction to the tic-tac-toe www. And I'm going to post the tic-tac-toe www classroom link in the Slack channel while everybody's at break. All right? Okay, so with that, we'll be back in 15 minutes. Okay, so we're back from a break. I did paste the link for the challenge into our Slack channel, which should be, let me bring over the JavaScript channel just a second, which should be right here. So if you follow this link inside of Slack, that should take you over to the project for the tic-tac-toe web. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. All right. And now let's talk about the Markdown project shortly. So this is sort of like the beginning of the Markdown project really quick. We know a little bit about this. Let me bring this open in a like a live server really quick. And let's see if I can get this to start up. And okay, so I have some text inside of this output div. It's really hard to see though, because it doesn't have any kind of a border around it or anything like that. So let me create a little style section. And in this style, this is just gonna be inline style, just to put a little border around the div and give it like a width and a height, so that we know that there's actual like content in there. So if I have, let's do with our div with the preview, let's do preview, and oh, you know what? I need to actually have this be like a correct targeter here. So this is preview, and then inside of here we're going to have there be a border, and this will be like 2 pixels solid red. This is like, sometimes I just want to see, yeah, there it is. Okay, so just so I can see what's inside, like which is which essentially, and I'll do this something similar for my source area, which is the text area. It's with an ID as source. Just say source, and that's going to be a border, again with 2 pixels solid, but this will be blue just to make it a little bit more so that we know which one is which. All right, and I need there to be like a height to my preview area. So I'll say min height will be, oh, I don't know. Let me make this like, let me make my min height like 40 pixels or something. Okay, so even if I don't have stuff down in here, I still have a little bit of height to it. So if I get rid of this text now that's inside of here, here's some text inside the preview area. I go back, it's still there. I can still see that my preview is down in this little corner, right? Or at least that's the idea, is that I know which one is which. So that can I can click render, nothing happens. But I know that based on like our challenges for this, let me go over to the project that we have here and go to the Markdown preview. That what we want is them to be side by side. I'm not quite there yet, but what I'm going to, that's more of a style thing. And what I'm going to do for now is kind of follow along with the tests for this project, and then see if I can like build up to get to a point where I'm bolding stuff. I know that I have this started right now. It's launched on. Let's see if I can get to. This is running on port 5555. But if I put this into, if I kill this server here and start it from the command line, like the instructions say to do, by doing npm start inside of a console. So I'm inside of my Markdown preview here. If I do npm start, it should, yeah, it starts it at this address 127.0.0.1, port 8080. And if I click on that, yeah, I get a Markdown preview. Let me go though into Chrome to do this, since that's where all the other stuff that I'm doing is for now. So here's my Chrome window. I still can't render anything. And if I go back into my code and put something inside the div, like some text or something like that, then what I'll get here if I reload is some text in the Markdown preview. What I want to be able to do though is I want to be able to type some stuff into this text area, where if I did my header and some lists down here, so I'll create a list of groceries. I don't know if I spelled that correctly, but I think it's somewhere near correct. And if I said, milk and then eggs, what I want there to be is there to be some HTML inside of this preview pane. That's really what I want. And to do that, I need to be able to actually get some progress here. I have to have some elements on the page for my tests to pass. I think that I have this headline H1. This headline H1. Let me put this on the left. Let me make this a little smaller and then break this out and put it on the right so it's easier to see. I need to have a Markdown preview, which I do. And I need to have a text area, which I do with this. And I need to have this has to have an ID of source, which if I right click on it and I go to inspect, I can see that in fact it does have an ID of source right there inside the inspector. This is a little cramped, but you can still kind of see it. Let me put it down at the bottom of the page though. Maybe that'll give me a little bit more space. So I can see here that this, if I go to, I don't want to go to styles, text area source. There we go. I can see that that does have the ID I want. And if I go and look at the preview div, well, it has an ID of preview. So if I just scroll down a little bit, click on inspect, I hover my cursor over the element that I want, right click it, and click inspect. That'll bring open that preview area inside of my inspector down here. And if I hover over it, I see that that's the part of the page that is in question. And it does have that ID of preview. And then last, I need this button with an ID of render, and I can see that right here. If I click over this item, it says ID of render. And so I have those basic elements that I need. I have those that I need. And this is what I did in the class, I think last Thursday, when I was demonstrating the actual Cypress tests. All right, so I need this to be able to render some text. So if I put some text into the source text field, when the user clicks the render button, I need this to get copied into the preview area. So I have this stuff in my source text field. Now if I click render, well, nothing's happening. Nothing's happening when I do that. And that's because if I click on this render button and I inspect it, let me scroll down. So I'm clicking over the render button. And I look at event listeners. I don't have any event listeners on this button. So I haven't added any yet. Does everybody see that? It says no event listeners right here. And I'm hovering over the actual button. So I know that clicking on it isn't going to do anything. It's not going to change my code at all. So I want to go in to VS Code here. And again, I'm going to try to put this on the left to try to make it a little easier to see both of them. And I'm going to make it a little smaller. So is that still readable or is that unreadable by people in the room? Is that okay? Or I can make it a little bigger if it needs. What was that?
I can read it.
You can read it? Okay. Zach, can you read it in the back? Okay. I just want to make sure. My eyes are really bad, so oftentimes my perspective on this is a little skewed. All right. So I have this button, and it has an ID of render here. I need to be able to run some JavaScript to have this button have an event listener. So I'm going to put a script tag at the bottom of the page. Let me make sure I have this spelled correctly. Yep. So why am I putting it at the bottom of the body? Does anybody know why I'm putting it at the bottom of the body? Missy and then Connor.
Because if you put it before the button is defined, the HTML, it won't recognize the button yet.
That's about right. So Missy said that the reason why I'm having it at the bottom is because if I have it above the body, then it won't recognize the HTML. It won't be able to see the HTML. And that's true. The reason why is that the body won't be in the page yet. So the way that the browser reads the HTML is from top to bottom. And if the script were here at the top, what will happen is that it'll read that script first, and then it'll immediately execute that script before any of this body HTML has been read. And so because it hasn't been read yet, then it goes ahead and tries to run the script on code that hasn't been put into the browser. The browser's not at that point yet, and it can't act on anything. So it's a really common bug that can bite people if they aren't aware. The easiest fix to this bug is to put your script at the bottom of the HTML. There are other fixes that I'll try to cover here in a little bit, such as waiting for certain events before you end up running the JavaScript code. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. Okay, so we have our script at the bottom of the page. This is the easiest solution. So what I need to do is I need to get a handle onto this button, and then I need to be able to add an event listener to it. Because yes, I could put a click handler on here. I could say click equals something inside of here if I wanted to. And let me just do alert, and this will say alert will say clicked, exclamation point. And then if I refresh this page and I click on the render, oh, what did I do wrong? Did I save? I thought I did. Weird. What am I doing wrong here? I oftentimes make mistakes. Can anybody see it? Oh, it's not click, it's on click. That's why. That was my mistake. So if I click render now, I get my clicked alert. This is one way to do it, but it's not the recommended way. Why wouldn't I want to have just a click handler right there on the HTML? Anybody tell me? Okay, cross-site scripting, possibly. I mean, I'm controlling the HTML here, but that's a good point. If you allow for HTML to get put into your page and somebody is able to write a click handler in that HTML, then they could execute arbitrary JavaScript on your page. But in this case, it doesn't have to do with cross-site scripting, although I think that that's a great consideration to keep in mind. It has to do with organization. It has to do with organization. The reason why I don't want to put an on-click event handler right on the HTML is that I want to separate where my behavior lives and where my structure of my page lives. So by taking it out of the HTML and putting it into the JavaScript, I know where all the code is in my program, and I don't have to think about, well, does it live on the HTML? Does it live in the JavaScript? And I know where it's going to be right away. It doesn't seem like a big thing right now because we don't have much code here, but a lot of applications get really big. And when you have some of your JavaScript in the HTML and some of your JavaScript in an actual script tag, things can get complicated. You can ask, any of our students of our prior courses. They get surprised at how big these applications get. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to take this on-click out. I'm going to take this on-click out, and I'm instead going to put it inside of here. So I'm going to say I need to do two things. The first is that I need to grab a handle onto the button. So I'm going to say const button equals get element by ID, and I need to remember how to type this. Get elements by ID. You know what? This is why. It's document.getElementById. That's my problem. And now if I pass in here render, well, this should be my button. So if I log this out, console.log the button, when I refresh this page, I should see that in my console. And I do. There's my button. And I can hover over it, and it shows me that, in fact, it's the right button in my page. So that's good. I have a handle onto the right button. I can get rid of that console.log now, and instead I can do something with this button. And what I want to do with it is I want to add an event listener. I want to add an event listener to the button, and the event listener that I want is click. All right, and when I click on the button, what I want to be able to do is I want to fire another function. So I'm going to create down here a function, and this function will be called render, or I'll just say convert markdown. convert markdown. Okay, and this is going to accept as an argument. It's going to accept the event that fired it. So I'm going to say that will be the events as the argument to this function. And for now, what I want is the event dot target dot. I think this is text content, if I remember right. I might have to look it up. Content, not context. Text content. You know what? I think it's lowercase because it's a property. This is
Uppercase.
Is it uppercase? See? Okay.
It's capital case.
Okay. Thank you very much. So the event is the thing that fires it, and then the target is the actual element that fired the events, and then the text content is a property of the element. So let me show you what I mean. If I type something inside of here, hello world here, and then I inspect this element. I need to inspect the text area. You know what? Let me actually let me do the same thing I did down here with the button. And I'm going to say source equals get element by ID source. And then I'm going to, sorry, I'm going to add my semicolons because I want to be a good JavaScripter for a minute. So I'm going to have my source there, and I'm going to console.log out this source. So I'm going to say console.log the source. And this may, when I refresh it, let me see if I can grab, trying to think if I can actually investigate it. Is it in, I can't do like an investigation of the, yeah, that stinks. That's too bad. Properties, that's what I wanted. That's what I wanted. All right. So if I go to, is it in child nodes? No, it's, let me grab it from inside the console. So if I grab it inside the console, doing the source equals document.getElementById, taking the source, and I'll make this const just to be nice. And now if I log this out, I was trying to think if I refresh the screen, the text inside of there is going to go away. So I log out the source. I have my text ID of source. And if I do source dot text content, so that's not text content then.
Value.
Is it value?
Yeah.
Thank you. That's the one I always forget. Normally, text content is what's the text node inside of an HTML element. Those are the two that I get mixed up with. So the source here will give you what's actually inside. And if I change it to something else, so hello class, and I don't want to say this, sorry, that was just a form of habit.
All the time.
If I do this again, now that I've changed it, the actual property updates right in line, which is really nice. I was used to debugging this in, if you debug this in Firefox, there's a little bit more that you can do with these than just like being able to hover over them, which is really nice. I'll try to show you what I mean by that. So if I grab this and I go over to Firefox and create a page like this, and open a console inside of here and paste the content that I have from document.source equals document.getOnID source. What I liked being able to do is actually update the hello world here and run this here. Now if I do source, you get to see this whole JavaScript object that's right in the console. If I come down, this is one of the things that Firefox does much better than Chrome. If I come down here, I can scroll until I find source down here. Where are you? It's definitely on the object. I'm just missing it. My eyes aren't seeing it. And you can actually see it update as you update the actual object. So if I change this to 3 exclamation points, you'd be able to actually see that source change live, which is really nice.
There's the value way down.
It's in value. It's not in source. You saw value. Yeah. It's right here. So if I run this again, you're right. It didn't update. So I must have had some other kind of like thing turned on when I did that. We can see that the value is updating live. So it's just a nice little debugging trick to be able to do that in the console. Let's go back over to Chrome since we have these side by side and finish this up. Okay. Let's go ahead and render the text over. And then what I want to be able to do is when I highlight some text, I'm not going to do all of the stories, but I'm going to highlight some text and I'm going to replace it with some other text after I do this. So I'm going to go ahead and render this up by bringing up my this up and changing target to target.source. And what I want to do here is convert to Markdown. This will be let's create some. Let's say let's text equals this source, and then what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to grab the content out of the preview div. So I'll need to do the same thing as I did for the other 2 elements and change this to preview. And this would also be changed to preview. And I think I have it spelled correctly. And then I'm going to say preview dot inner HTML. And this is, remember, inner HTML is the dangerous properties set. So you want to make sure that whatever you have inside of the preview text is actually inside of the source text area is actually safe to put into the preview area. And I'm going to make this equal to text when I click on the button. So although this is called convert to Markdown, it's not converting anything to Markdown yet. And when I save this and refresh, now if I take this sum text out, well, actually having it there is useful. So let's do, this is the new text. And if I click render, oh, I didn't actually have it fire. Let's see, add event listener on event target, 2 arguments required, 1 present. Of course. So my event listener is click, but I didn't pass the second one, which is convert Markdown. So that's the actual event listener that's going to get called when the click happens, right? So if I come back up in here and I say this is the new text, and then I click render, oh, that's so funny. So the event.target.source isn't what we think it is here, right? The event.target.source is in fact like undefined. So it's setting it equal to undefined now. Here the event.target should be, let's see what our target is.
Can I just?
Yep.
I'm sorry.
Did I lose you?
I was lost like 3 days ago.
Okay.
So the event is the click. The target is not the button.
So the target is the in this case it is the button. That's in fact why this is not firing correctly. You're right. What we want to do is get the content from this text area and put it into this div. And when we are, I was getting my features mixed up in my head. I wanted to, when I select one inside of this text box, that's going to be a different event that is in fact going to be the target of the text area, okay? But right now, because I'm clicking on the button, that's my click handler, and that's the thing that is actually the target. So instead of using the event here, thank you, IRF, for pointing that out.
I haven't even gotten the button stuff to work, so I'm still.
Okay.
You're like 6 steps ahead of where I'm at.
Okay.
Not to say to stop or slow down.
No, I can slow down. I didn't know that you were at that point, so that helps me to know where to kind of focus on. And Sue, what were you saying?
Well, I'm looking at your convert Markdown. You've got a parameter.
Yeah, the event.
In your
Yep.
I'm not even passing the.
You don't have to. Yeah.
Okay. So why are you putting? Then why put one in there?
That was where I was confusing my two features in my head while I was thinking about how to do this.
Okay.
Where I was confusing the one where we're one going to be converting to Markdown, and two when we're going to be highlighting or replacing some text that's inside of the inner the source of the text area. Okay.
Making it bold.
Yeah, making it bold or replacing it with another word or something like that. So let me go ahead and I'll keep calling this convert markdown for now. We don't need to have the event here. Remember, it gets passed anyway, whether or not we have it as an argument.
Your target.
In this case,
Shouldn't this be your source.value?
this should be the source.value. This is what we want to grab. So we want to say text, let text equal source. We have our source here on line 25, which is our source panel. So this is source.text, source.value. And then we want to copy that just for now as a first step into our preview, which we have already targeted on line 26. So our preview is the red div, and right now the text inside of there is undefined. So the preview inner HTML should equal whatever text we grab from the source value. So if we do those two things and we refresh the page and we say, does this work? And we click render, now the div's text says, does this work? And if I change this again, so here is the new text, and I click render, again, here is the new text gets copied into the div. Now that's not the purpose of the feature though. The feature is to use this marked library in order to convert whatever we have inside of here from Markdown over to HTML. So let's just remind ourselves what we talk about, what we talk about when we talk about rendering the Markdown. So here we have this render Markdown feature in the lesson, where we say, given that the user has entered some Markdown formatted text in the source text field, when the user clicks this render button, then the text is rendered and style as HTML into the preview area. So we want to use this marked library to do that conversion, and we can load it by using this script verbatim. I'm going to just expand this page so it's easier to read. That's about easier. So this is the script. If I copy this over and put this script into the head of my HTML page, up here, I'll put it under the style for now. And this is all one line. Looks a little wonky, but it's all one line. This is a file that is located inside of my files in my project. So it's located at this following location: node modules, marked, lib, mark.js. So let's take a look at it just really quick. So if I go into node modules and then scroll down, they're all alphabetical. So I'll go down to marked. So I'll find M. Here's marked. And now if I look inside of lib, and if I find mark.js, this is the file. This is a lot of stuff. We don't need to know what it all does. Okay? You really don't need to know what it all does. You just want to know like where it's coming from. It's coming from your local machine. It's getting served to your HTML from your local machine in the way that we've made this work. There's other ways to do this as well, but this is the way it's working right now. So I'll close up these files, and let's take a look at what happens when I have this marked file in the head of the page and I refresh. So I'm going to save it, refresh. So it doesn't look like anything's different. It doesn't look like anything's different. But I do have this marked function here. If I say marked, it's a function, and it says input parameter is undefined. And if I just reference marked, it's a function that expects some stuff. It expects an input parameter. In particular, if I do marked and then I give it a string like my header, like this, then what it does is it gives me back some HTML. Okay, and I have this wrong. I have to have a space after the my header part. And then it gives me back an H1 with an ID of my header and a value of my header. Does everybody see that? This is kind of a key part. We're using a library, and this is how you use the library. A library is code that somebody else wrote that you don't have to write yourself. And marked is written by somebody else. And in their README page, they actually talk about how to use the library. I'll go to that in a moment. But I just wanted to show people that if I call the marked function, which is available to me after this script has been included in the head of my page, and I pass it a string that is markdown compatible, it will convert that markdown over into HTML. And I can do that live in my console and actually try it out before I get too far along in my project. So with that, I have this marked function, which means that instead of saying text source value and preview inner HTML equals text, I could instead say preview.inner HTML equals marked taking the text. So the text is still the content from my text area up in here. But now if I type markdown in there, and I'll show you what I mean, if I type some markdown up in here and I hit render, so let's say my food list, okay? And now if I come down here and I say milk, eggs, and cheese, now if I click render, what I get down here is my food list, milk, eggs, and cheese. So something's going a little wrong here. Something seems to not be right. It's pasting in the exact content as it is. Did I not refresh? That's a good question. Let me see if I refresh it. If I do what I had before, my food list, and I render, oh, my food list. So it was a refresh problem. So if I make this bigger, and I come down and I say milk, I can really type, milk, eggs, and cheese. Well, what do we get when we output this? We get HTML down in here, because that's what marked gives us. If I grab all this text here, and inside of it, and if I call marked with that text, all right, let's see if it actually works. I don't know if doing it on multi-lines like that will actually work. Yeah, okay. So it didn't work because it was on multiple lines. I think that if I bring these in and do like new lines in here, like new line, and then bring this up, and then say, oh my gosh. Yeah, this up arrow is like making my life awful right now. And then at the end of here, I say new line, and then I say new line, and then I say new line. Oh, that should be enough. That should be enough new lines. Then I get back HTML with my header, an unordered list, and a list item of milk, a list item of eggs, a list item of cheese, in the end of the unordered list. Ira, did something just click for you?
Nope.
Oh, okay.
Pushing the wrong button.
We can get you some help. Sorry about that. So this is now our little markdown renderer. It's not perfect, but what it does do is it allows us to type in valid markdown and get back valid HTML. And a side note here that not everybody knows is that Some other things is that headers, like if I do H3, and then I close this H3, and then inside of here I say, this is the end. This is also valid HTML. Yeah, so what happens is that HTML, when it gets passed to a Markdown preview tool like Marked, is that it just gets passed through as plain HTML. Gets passed through as plain HTML. So Marked allows us to have at least some validation here of what is going in and what comes out are both valid. The fact that you can pass in HTML is what makes building a Markdown parser hard. Okay, so that is the very quick like Markdown converter, where this is now Markdown and this all here is now HTML. So this little bit here, this little function and this script on line 17 and the function on line 31 to 34 is enough to actually work with these targets and make this work. Let's go ahead and see what's next on the list. So we've rendered some Markdown, we rendered some text, we rendered some Markdown. The next one is to automatically render Markdown. And that can be a little tricky because what it is that if you automatically render every time you type into the source text field, what you're triggering here is a key press. It's a key press event. So if you had a key press event that was your event listener, it wouldn't be this render button that would be the event listener anymore. It would be the key press that would be the event listener. So let's just look this up. I might not implement this during our class right now because I want to be able to get to the next project next and also talk about this bolding thing. But if we did MDN key down events or key up events, both of these events are things that you could listen for. The key down event is similar to click, except for it's when you actually press a key. So the key down event is fired when the key press is down. And there's this other event called key press. Okay, we could look that up if we thought that maybe that would help us. But the key down event is fired for all keys regardless of whether they produce a character value. So key press only works for keys that produce a character value on the screen. It might be that this is the right one to use, but key down could be used for now because even if we do like a shift, we could still re-render the content with that. And so if we created an event listener for key down, and then we rendered the content off to the preview panel every time there was a key down, then all we'd be doing is we'd need to get the content, the source of the text area, and put it into the preview, passing through the marked library every time there's a key down event, right? To get like just as a quick, sorry, I didn't mean to switch panels there. As a quick like thought about how I do that, instead of doing this just a button of add event listener, if I did a documents dot add event listener, and if I did here key down, and then the trigger that we're going to do again is convert Markdown. No, that's not right. Convert Markdown. And now I need to get rid of these extra characters that are not needed. So convert Markdown is the again the function that we want to call.
But you're not typing in your document.
Yeah. So the question is, if we're not typing in the document and we're pressing keys, are we still going to render? And the answer to that is yeah. So this would create some bugginess. I just want to demonstrate like what it would look like. So I'm not saying that this is the perfect solution, and I think that you're 100% correct, Sue, that what we probably want here is not just a key down. Like, that's probably too general. It's probably too general. I could do something where I say, I could say that what we could do is source.add event listener. And inside the source, if there's a key down event inside the source, then maybe we would be typing into the source, right? I think that that would fire. So let me see if I do something here. If I do console.log, and I'm just going to type in fire every time this actually gets called. Every time it gets called, it's going to console.log fire. So now if I come into my document and I refresh, and I open up a console here at the bottom so I can see if this gets triggered. If I come in here and type something, fire, 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 right? It's firing every single time, and it's sending that text down below. So if I did, this is the header. And then if I say 1, 2, 3, it's changing the output every time I type an event. Now if I come up here, if I select this and I'm typing now, I'm typing, I really am, my events do not fire because the key down event, it only triggers when I am on the source. So I've added this event listener key down only to this area in here. Only to this area in here. Okay? Okay. So, Sue, yes?
Your key down is not getting all of your letters.
It's the last one.
Oh, the last one's missing. Look at that. Interesting. That's you are 100% correct. So that's some buggy behavior there.
Well, I ended up using key up.
Yep.
Yeah, input's pretty sensitive.
Good point. So if I do this as input instead of key down, and I type this as 3, so input also is missing the character. It looks like. Oh, I haven't refreshed the page. Thank you. So, thank you. My header, and now it actually gets the last letter. I can delete it and add it, and it adds it as expected.
So is
Nice debugging, group.
Is input?
Input is another event. Let's take a look at it.
Okay.
So if we do
It's
MDN input
right.
event, this is an event that works with elements that can accept input. So that includes several different kinds of elements. An input element, a select element, a text area element, a content editable, a design mode. These content editable design modes are very rare. You almost never see these. Okay, so don't trouble yourself wondering like, whoa, what's that? You have to remember that HTML is really old, and a lot of these elements are not used anymore, or they're not recommended to be used. Design mode, content editable, not design mode, is one of those elements that like people generally don't use very much. Okay, so that's a quick way to get the key press to work. Now I want to do one more thing, which is that I want to replace some text. I want to replace text that's selected. So I'm going to create another button that's going to do that. Below my render, so I'm going to create a button here, and I'm going to have this be ID equals replace, replace. I think I spelled that right. And so it says, this is going to say replace here. And I'll refresh the page, and I see replace down now at the bottom. So now what I need to do is I need to have there be an event listener for replace. So I'm going to create const replace, and this is going to equal documents.getElementById again. And this is going to be replace. And the trick with this, I'm going to separate this out with some space. I need to add an event listener to this replace button so that whatever I am selecting inside of my text area, I will be able to go ahead and replace that text with something else. And replace that text with something else. And let's take a look at it. So if I have my event listener, I need to add one. So I'm going to do that above my button. I'm going to say replace dot add event listener, and this is going to be click, and just as though it's a bold button, for example, right? What we're going to do is we're going to say replace text. I'm going to create a function called replace text that'll replace whatever text is selected inside of my input field. So there is a property of these fields. Let's bring this up really quick. There's a property of these text inputs. Let me go over to, here it is. HTML input element has a function on it called setRangeText. So this is a method that replaces a range of text in an input or a text array element with a new string. Replaces a range of text in an input or a text array element with a new string. So it takes a replacement, and it optionally takes a start and an end. Optionally takes a start and an end. Why are they optional, I wonder? Well, it says that they're optional because the zero base index of the first character replaced, but it defaults to the current selection start value of whatever the input field is. So when we are selecting stuff inside of an input, there's this selection start property that exists on that input element for us. And our setRangeText hooks into that property and allows us to get an index into its content, just like its content is a string, where strings start at 0 and they go until whatever the length of the string is minus 1. Okay? And then the end, which is the second optional argument to this function, it is also a zero-based index of character after the last character to replace, but it indeed also defaults to the current selection end value. So selection end is a thing that is managed by the input field for you. So let's see what this looks like when we do this. There's a little example down here that's kind of nice. So here's some HTML. I'll make this bigger. Here's some HTML. It's an input. It has text, type text. It has a size of 30. That's just how wide it is. And you note that this is the text area that's going to be replaced. This one down here at the bottom. And this function selectText says input equals document.getElementById text box, which is the text box that we are currently selecting text in, this one. And it says input.focus, which means that when we put our thing inside of it, it becomes, did everybody see how the style changed around the box when I clicked inside of it? Everybody see that? I am not focused, and now I'm focused on the box. Now I'm not, and now I'm focused on the box. So the focus is like which element is currently active on the window. And then it calls setRangeText, and what it's replacing here is it's replacing whatever's been selected, well, this was replacing 14 to 17, with the word already, So I don't even actually have to select anything inside of here. If I just click update text, it replaces not with already. But what's the bug? If I select it, see how that's selected now? Let's see if I click update text again. Oh, look, it's like changing it, but it's already been replaced. So it's just replacing it again and again and again. So that's not super great, right? That's not super great. Let me open this in a little sandbox, which is a sandbox called CodePen, which is kind of useful. And I have the same thing here. I have the same thing, except for now I get to just change the, I can change the JavaScript now. So let me remove this 14 and 17, and let me remove the select just for now. And it's going to now, instead of changing a fixed input, anything that I select when I click update text gets replaced with the word already. This gets replaced with the word already, and now this gets replaced with the word already, because my selection is the start and end of the replacement on the set range text. So let's see what that looks like. If I come back over to my code that we've been fiddling with, let me bring this over here. So this is set range text. That's what we were just playing with. And what I need to do is if I'm selected inside of here and I say my text, what I want to be able to do is select this and then hit replace and have it replace my text with some other word. That's sort of my smoke test to make sure that this works. So replace text needs to be a function. Replace text needs to be a function. And we're going to say replace text here. And for now, it doesn't need to take an argument because we're going to use the source as our content to change. So we've said source.replace text, and we're going to say new text. New text. So if I highlight some text in here and I click replace, oh, what did I do wrong?
Refresh and save.
Refresh. Thank you so much, Sue. If I say old text and I click highlight this and I replace it, oh, I have an error. Replace source.replace text is not a function. What is this? What am I doing wrong? This is should work with inputs and text areas. Should work with inputs and text areas. My source is a text area.
Targeting source.value dot replace.
Source.set range text and what you want.
Ooh, it's set range text. Thank you so much. Of course, I called the wrong function name. That was my mistake. It's set range text, not replace text. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, that was your function name.
Yeah, so I think it's set range text. Let's just double check. Yeah, set range text. Thank you. And I'm going to say new text here. And so I will refresh again. This would be old. I did save. I did save. I know that because the X is not as a circle. Thank you though. Old text here. If I select it, I click replace, it comes to new text. And if I select this and I replace, it says new text. And I select this and replace new text. So that means that here's the trick. This expects some. This takes, I should say, some new text, right? Like that's the. It's a static value. It doesn't change. This function isn't suitable for our needs because what we want to do is instead of this new text, what we want to do is say if this is the old text, we want to add two stars, I should say, on either side to bold it. That's what we want to do. So what we need to be able to get is we need to be able to get the current text, okay? And then we need to be able to take the current text and wrap it with some stars, and then replace that where the selection is. Replace that where the selection is. That's sort of the basic bolding story, okay? So am I putting people on a better path now to like kind of know where to go from this? I don't want to completely give it to you, but what you have here is in your source, remember what it was using before as its triggers. It was saying that the selection start and the selection end. So if I select this whole thing here and I right click, oh, you know what? Let me see if I can I do, if I do source, I think I can do this live. Source dot selection start is 0. And source dot selection end is 12. So this currently is all of the text, right? And if I did source dot value starting at 0, or starting at selection source dot selection start, and then I want to actually slice this from two like places, right? I want to say source.value.slice, not splice, slice, and then it needs to take two things: source.selection start and source.selection end. And when I do that, I get back that text, old text. So if I wanted to see what I had selected like this, and I do this again, it's now just text. So that's my actual input for the function that would be replacing the text. I need to grab what I have selected on this input, text input element, grab that text that I have selected by using the source.value.slice, source selection start, source selection end, and use that as a parameter to a function that wraps that text up in stars to the left and the right, unless it's already bolded. And in that case, I need to take the stars off. So I don't want to give you all the solutions yet to Markdown previews, but I wanted to give you enough hints to kind of put you in the right direction on this. Now, I'm going to paste all these links that I have in this page for this MDN page right into Slack so that you can follow those. I'm also going to paste this CodePen right into Slack as well. So this CodePen is now my CodePen, and both of these are going to go right into Slack so that you can reference them. Okay? So in Slack here, we'll do links from the live walkthrough. And we will have the first one, and then we'll also have this CodePen as well. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this entire file and put this in as a link in here as well. So I'll say that this is going to be, what I'll do is, let me create a new CodePen really quick. I need to go and create a new one. So this new CodePen here is going to be all HTML. The only thing that's not going to work here is that this link to marked is not going to work, because this is going to some node modules thing that doesn't exist on CodePen. So let me grab the CDN link for marked. This should be enough. So if I copied that, oh, I want this minimized. If I paste that in here under the source instead of my node modules, then at least it'll work in the page for you. Let me see if this works. ZZ, and replace it with that, and wrap it up in strings. Okay, so now all of this can go straight into CodePen, and it should actually work. Yeah. So this code pen will be, again, let me share. Can I share it? I know I can do it somehow. Saved it. Oh, you know what? This will be, let me just rename it. This will be marked example. Cool. So if I paste this into Slack, you should be able to visit this at any time and see that code pen. Okay? So those should give you some like pointers on how to do the bolding stuff, because I know it's really challenging. And I want it to be challenging, but I don't want it to be frustrating to the point where like people are like rage quitting, right? Nobody wants to do that. Okay. Let me see if there's something going on here. Great, great. So now it's working. That's good. All right, let's go back over to JavaScript. All right, so let's talk for the next 13 minutes about the tic-tac-toe www project really quick, okay? So I'm gonna close some of these down now so that we can look at that project. Okay, so tic-tac-toe web. You've already done tic-tac-toe in the command line, mostly. A lot of people are pretty far along with that. We now need to do it inside of our browser, okay? So our wireframe is going to be basically the same thing. It's going to be our grid. It's just that now I've provided you a template that does the grid for you. It does the blank grid for you. It doesn't do all of the functions that you need for this. But what we have inside of our classroom is a link to a template repository, which is this one. And I'll grab this and bring it in and load it up myself. Let me come over to my console, kill this, cd up to, do I have www in here? I don't, great. So let me come over and clone it and put it in here, do a git clone. It is? Oh, I do have it, look at that. So let me do, thank you very much, tic-tac-toe www, and let me load this up. I think that I can do the same npm start. Okay. I don't have a start in here, but I don't know that I need one either for this. We have our main.js, right? That's our starting script. And let me just run this really quick. Oh, that's not right. Let me run this really quick and start this up so that we can actually see the tic-tac-toe board. So this is what it's going to look like when you start it up. I'm going to make it a little smaller so everybody can see the whole thing. The only thing is that if I click Start Game, nothing happens. Nothing happens inside of here. If I look at my source, what I have inside of here, the stuff that matters, is all of this up here. I have this main.js. The only problem is that my main.js, I need this to probably, well, actually we have some HTML that it'll be able to access to, but if you try to start writing to these cells before you start a game, then what's going to happen is that it's not going to be able to because they won't have it written yet. So you want to start your game by clicking on this button at the bottom of the page, which is this button down here. You're not going to want to like start a game before the button is clicked. And that's what our instructions talk about, okay? Our instructions say that when we start the game off, there's a start game button at the bottom, and then it will say something like player X's turn or player O's turn. And when X makes a move, it's going to put an X in the board, and then it's going to say player O's turn, okay? Here's the thing. We do have some Cypress tests to go along with this. So if I come into my terminal here and I do npm install, it's going to get all that stuff ready again. So I'll let it go ahead and do that. While we're waiting, I'll take a look at some of these other stories. But our Cypress integration tests are going to be able to at least get us bootstrapped up. And bootstrapped meaning that like we can start the page up and actually get this get this running. If you aren't able to start this up with loading the page from a JavaScript like start script, which I don't think we added one. I'll teach you how to get one in there so that it works for you. So if I run this command, npx static node static, sorry, and I'll put this in the instructions. I think that this single instruction got missed. It will run my tic-tac-toe game at 127001, and if I copy this and go over to node and run it, we'll see that it's running. Oh wait, do I have two things running? Let me refresh. What's not found? What did I do wrong?
Oh, maybe we don't have the index yet.
Let me take a look. Oh, I'm in the wrong directory. That's my mistake. So let me cd into tic-tac-toe. And now I need to actually do the same command again. There should, in fact, be the correct thing inside of here. Yeah, tic-tac-toe. So this starts it up running at 127001. If I install my dependencies with npm install, then I should be able to do, again here, Cypress open. And I think I have to do npx Cypress open inside of here. And this will open up Cypress for me, and it'll actually run Cypress against the integration tests that are inside of my project. The integration tests, by the way, are inside of Cypress and inside of integration, and then we have tic-tac-toe specs here. You could read those specs if you wished, but what it's going to do, let me turn off the ESLint. What it's going to do is it's going to see if it can visit the home page. It's going to check to see if the page contains an H2 with the content of tic-tac-toe. It's going to check to see if the board is empty. It's going to check to see if the start button is clickable. And after starting a game by clicking the start button, it's going to check to see if the start button has been disabled. And Cypress is starting, so that's why it took control of my window. And after it checks to see if the start button has been disabled, it's going to check to see inside of a status section of the page if it contains the text players X's turn. And if it doesn't, this test will fail. And if the start button doesn't get disabled after you click it, this test will fail. Now you can try to get these tests to pass. That's cool if you want to. That's awesome. We do want to follow the rules of the project though. And the rules of the project are that when we start up and the user clicks start game, then the start button is disabled, which is why the test is actually comparing against the start game button. And the status area contains player X's turn. So we just progress these. These stories up. So we say given an empty board and the current player is X, when the user selects a cell, then the board redraws and X appears on that cell and the turn ends. And the current player changes from X to O. You can probably reuse a lot of your logic from your command line tic-tac-toe game, but not the part that outputs the tic-tac-toe text back out to the console. So in your command line tic-tac-toe game, there's no start button to click, right? You just start the program and enter in your move. You enter in your move by entering some text. But in this case, instead of entering text, what you need to do is you need to click on these individual squares. So what are we going to need inside of each one of these squares? If we look at the page's HTML content,
Giant visible button.
would you need a button on the square?
It's not a button.
What do you think?
Event listeners.
Yeah, you're going to need an event listener. So we have a row here. Look at the board. The board is all of this contents, right, highlighted in blue. And then we have a row with row 1 and row 2 and row 3. And if we dig into the row, we have a div with cell 0, cell 1, cell 2. And then, hey, look, we have cell 3, cell 4, cell 5. So what we need to do is add an event listener to each one of these cells.
So is there something further up that's setting the size of all that stuff?
It's CSS. Yeah, so if you look at the CSS of this page, it's what actually sets up the sizes and stuff like that. I did that for you because that's actually the biggest pain in the neck of this entire project, is getting all of this to be the right size and to only... Well, I will say it's one of the more frustrating parts. Doesn't mean you won't encounter frustrating things, though. But in my style sheet, which is, I have a style sheet here, you can actually look at what I added in for a style sheet if you want. I wrote this over the summer, I think. We haven't covered CSS a lot in this course, and that's because this is really more of a JavaScript course. And so I didn't want you all to have to struggle with trying to make CSS do what you want. And I'll be honest, making CSS do what you want is one of the more frustrating parts of web development until you really understand CSS, which is kind of a whole nother brain shift. It's not harder than JavaScript, it's just different. It's just different. Okay, so you have this elements. Let me make this come over here. So you have this elements, and you can add event listeners to these cells. Like if you add an event listener to this row, it's one event listener, and if you click anywhere on that row, it's all the same event listener. So what you need are 9 event listeners. And there's a bunch of different ways to add 9 event listeners to this. And I want to let you know as well that you don't have to keep the HTML exactly like this. I just wouldn't change any of the IDs. I'd leave the IDs the same, and the order in which the HTML appears. If you left it the same, you wouldn't mess up with any of the CSS rules. But if you wanted to add a class to these divs and target them as a class and add event listeners that way, totally doable. If you wanted to get all the children of a row and add event listeners to them in a loop, totally, you could do that too. So I just wanted to let you know there's a bunch of different ways to add those event listeners for clicking on them. So the first event listener that you're going to want to add is to the Start Game button. And that Start Game button is going to sort of kick off the whole thing. And you're going to want to have your code for this inside of this file main.js. And inside of main.js, if you put your code there, that's what's actually going to have the parts about adding event listeners to the button and adding event listeners to the various divs. Now you can have all of your code in one file if you want. That's perfectly fine. I would say that for this, that would be the easiest thing to do. Okay? And maybe next week we'll talk a little bit about how you could break up your code across multiple files, which is another way of organizing your code. I've said that you can organize your code by keeping it all in JavaScript files rather than having it in JavaScript and in the HTML. So if you have it all in a JavaScript file that gets sourced by the HTML, which is how this works, this is the actual HTML that gets put up in the browser, you can see that it gets sourced right here. So all of your JavaScript would be inside of the page when it loads. Next week, we'll be taking on a slightly larger project, and in that project, it might benefit you to have multiple JavaScript files and to organize them such a way that it makes a little more sense to you where your functions are for certain things. But you don't have to do that for this project. This one's a size that still one file should work. Okay.
So to be clear, we're going to put our JavaScript in main.js, not in the index.html.
I would recommend putting it in main.js.
Okay.
If you chose to put it in index.html as well, down here at the bottom, in a script down here, Sue, if you wanted, you could do that. You could have it down here. I'm sorry. Yeah, this would work. Inside of a script like this, I think this would work. Yeah. But because you already have the main.js,
Yep.
it might be easier to just put it there.
Okay.
It's totally up to you, though. It's your code, it's your project, and your organization. All right? You're not going to break our tests by having your code in the index.html versus the main.js. So that's the introduction to tic-tac-toe www. Now, I'm going to be here tomorrow on Slack, and if people have questions, they can start hitting me up on that. If you want to tackle this, if you want to start tackling this later this weekend, we'll still be available for questions this weekend too. So don't feel like you can't talk to us. I know that this group has been a little more hesitant to jump on Slack when they run into a hiccup than other groups, but you should know that you're invited to ask questions and to dig in a little further or to try to get unstuck with us. So definitely myself and Alex will be there to help to get you out of a rut if you find yourself in one. Everybody okay? Any questions? Concerns? Okay, cool. Sue, yeah.
Are the directions as far as going through the install for, because a clone, are there other pieces, do I need to do an install, or the Cypress I need to?
If you want to run the Cypress tests, you're right that there's an instruction missing in this project that is kind of frustrating. So I will put the instructions on how to run the server to get it on 127001 and how to run the Cypress tests in the project, and they'll be using npx to do that. Okay. And I'll show you how to do that.
And I'm familiar with the npx to get the server running.
Yep.
And to start, but I've downloaded I cloned it.
Yep.
I need to do another step.
Do you need to do an npm install?
Yes.
I don't think so. Let me just check.
I would imagine you would if we've got a ignore in there.
So there are no dependencies other than node static. So you would want to do an npm install, Sue, and then from there, once you've done an npm install, as I did, npm install, you can then do a node static. You should be able to do npx node static without having to download it again, I think. It'll just run it. Let's just see if it does it. Yeah.
That's to host it, or is that for
This is to run the server. Yeah, so this runs the server at 127.0.0.1 8080. Okay, and I'll put those instructions inside the lesson because it looks like they were excluded for some reason.
Okay.
Yeah. Connor, you have other questions? Ira, you have another question?
I just gotta get going.
Okay.
It's an hour drive home.
Have a great drive home. Be safe. Hit us up with any questions. Okay.
I was wondering if you put that link to the JavaScript file up top intentionally.
Which one?
On the index.html file.
Oh, no, we're not trying to trip you up.
Oh, but if it's up there, we'll be able to point here.
So keep in mind, yeah, so, shoot, what's it? Will that main.js trip you up?
Because I did that one day, and it's one of those things where like you start questioning.
Right, because is it going to add event listeners to the wrong things?
If they won't be able to find them, is what I found.
Yeah, this is going to run then immediately, isn't it?
And it took me it was one of those things where I was like, this guy's blue, right? Because you write all this code, it makes sense to you, and it's just this one little thing, and you start to like bang. Now, then again, it's good because you'll never make that mistake again.
Yeah.
It's just a painful one.
I think you're right. I think it will, in fact. I'll make a note of that, and I'll post it.
If the event listeners are in a different file,
No,
it's the order in which it loads. So if this script is here, and it's adding event listeners, and they haven't been written to the page. So it's the difference between taking this here and putting it, yes, down here at the bottom of the body.
Yeah.
So if it's down at the bottom of the body, then it will work just fine.
Now, if you
That's where it should have been. My
So you guys
apologies.
are trying to get people.
I will put a post to the whole channel just to have people move that down there.
well, if they haven't
Never make a
moved it,
mistake twice. I can tell you that much.
I was gonna say, if you reload your code, if you, commit it,
And push.
or make, yeah.
It won't push to the repositories that have already been cloned.
Ah,
So that's
right.
yeah.
I don't know who else has the.
I'll make the change now, but
Now, if, with the marked,
yep.
that needs to be at the top though, correct?
Marked does need to be at the top because what it's doing is that it is getting that library from a third-party source, or from your local files, and it needs to be there before you use it. So having that in the head is important. Yeah. Yeah, let me make this change. Let me come into index and I'm going to write this. Yeah, thanks for the heads up there, Connor.
It's a good little learning lesson. It's just one of those that's kind of like it can really piss people off. Just 'cause, like,
It's a very small thing. Yeah, you're right. So this is going to be move the main.js so that
I still wrote myself the other day.
after all the HTML content.
Mostly the latter, right? Mostly the latter.
Yeah, that wasn't working. I get pretty angry sometimes when I code and I just start using cursor marks for everything and that calms me down. It's good, and then I just gotta go back and change it out so I show some of the things that I actually want to improve on buildings. Since then, I think I would.
Kids fall without getting hurt.
This is true. There's a video that's been going around of a cat like slipping off of like a little shanty somewhere and somehow magically flap the plans right side up. It's pretty funny.
I read something in Smithsonian magazine, this was years ago, where century scientific tests, some guy was dropping animals, body parts, different heights.
Well, there's a pad surface.
Yeah, this, lady.
Right. Way before, animal testing.
You can fall from a 3-story building without getting hurt.
Wow.
A mouse can go about 10 stories.
That's pretty crazy.
Smaller than a mouse, like a little bug or something. You have to know their weight resistance and all that is such that you should have sufficient so it'll go. That's pretty cool. There's a 2000 project in a base. Oh, that's right.
Josh, this whole lesson was super helpful for him.
It's installed.
Was it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you can see some of the overlap, like event history and stuff.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, depending on how you want